Hi, I am Tim Cook, and this is video 2 of the training session on business planning in marine protected areas. This program is organized by MedPAN, Brijuni National Park, and BlueSeeds. In the previous video, we explored the need to properly finance MPAs. Here, I will explain how to use a business plan tool to analyze the financial data of your MPA and calculate its financing gap. So, we've seen that to be effective, meaning to achieve their preservation goals, marine protected areas need to be able to deliver protection. And we've also seen that for this, they need the resources, staff, and budget. So in other words, what they need is financial sustainability. And for protected areas, financial sustainability can be defined as the ability for a protected area to secure sufficient, stable, and long-term financial resources, and also to allocate these resources in a timely and appropriate manner to cover the costs necessary for the effective and efficient management of a protected area in accordance with its conservation objectives. Unfortunately, constant and sustainable funding is not the reality for most marine protected areas. MPA revenues vary a lot over time, as this figure shows, and they often depend on short-term sources of financing to fully implement management plans. As you can see here, the aimed financing should be rather constant. However, in this theoretical model of the funding of an MPA, we see that the variation over time is quite significant, which can threaten some of the conservation activities of the MPA. I think that nobody here considers that conservation should be thought of as a business. However, as we've seen, conservation is underfunded, so we do need to think of it in a cost-effective way. We do need long-term financial planning. So what is a business strategy and how can this apply to a marine protected area? Today we can define a business strategy as a strategy that does not just involve increasing revenues, which also involves building the capacity to manage resources well and meet the needs of diverse and changing stakeholders, and do this both now and into the foreseeable future. So what does long-term financial planning for a protected area look like? Well, it looks like this figure. This figure was taken from the Guide on Financing Mechanisms for Mediterranean MPAs, currently under publication by BlueSeeds and the Mather Foundation. And the first step here is to plan the future costs of your MPA, which are needed to reach the conservation objectives in the management plan. The second step is to assess your past and present sources. Third step, you need to plan your future revenues, and if the difference between your costs and your revenues is positive, it means you have a financing gap. The fifth step is to try to reduce this financing gap by reducing your costs. You can also try to review and optimize your funding sources to reduce this gap. Finally, this may not be sufficient, and you will need to implement new financing mechanisms for your marine protected area. Presented differently, you see that the 7 steps of the financial planning roadmap form a system. This is because building a financial strategy is an iterative process. The strategy is constantly revised until the financing gap of the MPA is close to zero. Where do you start? You start with a management plan. The management plan is the Bible of your MPA because it contains all the objectives that need to be reached and thus the activities that need to be implemented to reach the conservation objectives of the MPA. So from here, you can plan future costs, and by assessing current financial resources and future revenues, you can assess your financing gap, which is the difference between costs and revenues. Now, if the financing gap is positive, meaning you have a financing gap, well, there is the possibility to reduce your costs. However, if this is not sufficient, it is possible to change or increase your existing funding sources or find new financial sources for your MPA. And so you see here how this is an iterative process. Every change in the system will affect the financing gap until eventually, hopefully, there will be a moment when the financing gap is close to zero, which means that your financial strategy is a good one. So in this training session, you will learn to develop a financial strategy for your marine protected area using a tool, which is the business plan tool. So what is the business plan tool? The tool you'll be using is an updated version of the MedPAN tool, which was developed in 2015 by Vertigo Lab, MedPAN, the SPA, RAC, and WWF Mediterranean, with the support of the MAVA Foundation. It is actually an Excel file containing 6 sheets. The first sheet is the general description of the tool, and the second one describes how to use it. The third one is about recurrent costs of your protected area. The fourth, investment costs. The fifth, revenues. And the sixth is a summary of the costs and revenues of your MPA. So let's take the financial planning of your MPA step by step. Step 1, plan your future costs. Now, before you do that, you need to make sure you have a management plan for your MPA. As I said, the management plan is the Bible of your MPA and defines the conservation goals of your marine protected area. So before you can plan future costs, well, using this management plan, you need to define all the activities that are necessary to reach the conservation objectives which are found in that plan. And then for each of those activities, you need to evaluate their costs to be able to evaluate all the costs which are needed to reach your conservation objectives. So the first part of planning your future costs is to define all the activities that are necessary to reach your conservation objectives. Now these can be diverse, and here is a table presenting different categories of activities, but not all types of activities are necessarily presented here. It's an example showing you the main type of activities that you need to think about when you do this listing. For example, management and protection of natural resources, which include many types of activities like control and enforcement, or research, monitoring, mooring maintenance, or habitat restoration, or even the management of cultural resources. Another big group of activities is education and awareness raising programs, which include different types of activities like education or information of the general public, or even the development of livelihoods. Another group is tourism activities management, for example, concessions and special uses, visitor safety, or visitor education. Extractive activities management can be a very important activity, including fisheries management or other extractive uses. Administrative management, very important and sometimes overlooked. It includes planning or general administrative management, financial management, stakeholder engagement and partnerships, or IT activities. And finally, exploitation and maintenance facilities, not to be overlooked either. Facilities for boats, for example, buildings and lands, paths and roads, or even underwater trails. It is important to stress that during this phase, when you are listing all the activities necessary to reach your conservation objectives, you need to be as detailed as possible. For example, if you are listing the enforcement activities like MPA patrolling, you literally need to think about every type of equipment needed, the human resource, and the occurrence of this activity. For example, you might need one boat, fuel, how much, and binoculars, how many pairs of binoculars do you need? Human resources, how many people, 2 rangers, for example, and the occurrence of this activity, 2 patrols a week, for example. Okay, so now that you've made a detailed list of all the activities which are necessary to reach your conservation objectives, you need to evaluate the costs of each one of those activities. So taking the example mentioned earlier of patrolling, this activity has costs which can be put into different categories. Investment costs, first of all. You might need a semi-rigid inflatable boat, which would cost you 15,000 euros annually. You might need another fiberglass rigid boat, and you might need uniforms for 4 patrol officers. You will need staff, of course, human resources costs, 2 experienced patrol officers, which would cost 42,000 euros per officer the first year, and maybe another 2 junior patrol officers. And finally, there are recurrent costs, which are often overlooked, but are extremely important. Maintenance for the 2 boats, which would cost you maybe 2,000 euros per boat per year. Fuel, of course. Berthing fee, insurance for the boats, and boat administrative fees. So we have now obtained the total annual budget per item of expenditure for the implementation of all management objectives. Now, in the example mentioned earlier of patrols and enforcement, what we now have is the costs per year over the time frame of our entire management plan. And we do notice some characteristics. Investment costs, for example, are very high during the first year, but they are close to 0 the following year. So this needs to be kept in mind for a good management of funds. Recurrent costs, however, we notice that recurrent costs are constant over the course of the time frame of the management plan. So the first step when using the business plan tool is to enter all these identified recurrent and investment costs necessary to achieve the conservation goals identified in the management plan into the cells that are available under recurrent costs or investment costs. And to do this for every year, and do not hesitate to add lines to the lines which are already available in case you have new categories of costs. Okay, so now that you've planned your future costs using the activities that you've identified in your management plan to reach your conservation objectives, you need to assess your current financial resources, which means assessing your known past and present revenues. So what kind of revenues are we talking about? Well, your MPA may have different types of revenues. It might have government revenues from local authorities, government revenues from regional authorities or from the central government. It might have revenues from international donors or NGOs. It might have revenues from the private sector. It might have self-financing mechanisms. And it finally might have donations. So all these different types of revenues need to be carefully listed and put together in a table. Now, the third step to the financial planning of your MPA is to plan future revenues. You need to assess your future revenues over the same period of time as used earlier for the cost assessment phase, which is the period of time of your management plan. And future revenues can be both a continuity of existing revenues as well as new sources of funding. Whatever the type of future revenues, they all need to be listed carefully. Now that you've identified your current and future types of revenues, you can enter them into the business plan tool as you did earlier for the cost assessment phase and So this will help identify the number of funding sources, the dominance of certain types of incomes, and the dependency you have to these sources. It will also help identify the funding trends. For example, is a revenue declining over time or not? Now, the fourth step to your financial planning is to assess the financing gap of your MPA. Now, this is really the easiest part because you've done all the work. Now that you've entered the total revenues and the total costs to reach your conservation objectives, the financing gap will be calculated automatically by the business plan tool. So enter these revenues and enter these costs, and the business plan tool will calculate automatically your financing gap. So once you've done the work of estimating all your activities and their costs and your revenues, entering those costs and those revenues in the business plan tool is an easy way to estimate your financial gap. And you will maybe discover that this gap is actually constant over several years, but then increases. So you will understand the trends of this gap over time. What the business plan tool also provides is the proportion of the different costs for the period considered. So you might discover that, well, human resources are the biggest cost in your budget. And finally, what the business plan tool provides is the proportion of revenues per source. So you might discover that the funding from the private sector represents the biggest part of your income. And so knowing these different proportions is important to understand how your financial planning needs to be adjusted in the future. So to conclude, assessing the financing gap will allow you to estimate the effort which is required to close it. And in this way, it will be possible to identify various measures to be put in place to fill this gap. And we will see these measures in the following videos. These include reducing the costs or optimizing your revenues, but also identifying new financing mechanisms for your marine protected area. Thank you very much for your attention. Analyzing the financial data of your MPA with the business plan tool may seem like a straightforward, if not even a simple exercise. However, it must be done seriously and thoroughly if you are to properly assess its financing gap. Only after this step can you begin to try to close the gap of your MPA. In the next video, we will explore ways to reduce costs and optimize revenues. See you soon.